All right, so this week we are taking on 3 different chapters. We are going to look at some major transformations in U.S. history from post-World War II optimism of the 1950s through the turmoil of the 1960s and into the political shift of the 1970s. So as you listen, I want you to think about this question. How did the United States go from confidence and prosperity to division and distrust, and then towards conservatism? There we go. So let's look at Chapter 25, This Troubled Innocence. So the 1950s. After World War II, the United States was powerful, wealthy, and confident. The economy was booming, right? We're out of the Great Depression. We're spending money. We have jobs again. Suburbs were expanding rapidly. Consumer culture grew. So consumerism, like buying cars, buying TVs, buying things like for your household appliances, like refrigerators, washing machines, and many Americans believed in stability and progress, but beneath all that prosperity, there's a lot of serious tension happening. First, there was the Cold War, a global struggle against communism. This led to fear at home, known as the Red Scare, where Americans worried about communist influence. So the fear of communism in the US during the 1950s is known as the Red Scare. At the same time, African Americans still faced segregation. Women were pushed back into traditional roles, and conformity was expected. So this fear of communism also comes from this guy, Senator McCarthy, and it's known as McCarthyism. And you're going to read about that and how he starts it, and then unfortunately his demise at the end of McCarthyism. And then again, that limits of prosperity. So while, the 1950s, it looks stable, and we talk about how great the 1950s were, and we have the boomer generation that came out of that, really things were actually just setting the stage for a lot of change that's going to come at the end of the 50s, the 60s, and then roll into the 70s. So let's move on to the 1960s, liberalism and its challenges. So in the 1960s, we see those tensions just explode into activism. We also see a lot of reform happening. President Kennedy and this guy, President Johnson, promoted liberalism, the idea that government should help solve problems. When JFK is assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, and he's going to push a domestic agenda called the Great Society. And in the Great Society, he aimed to reduce poverty, expand education, and promote civil rights. So the Great Society was LBJ's program to reduce poverty and expand opportunity. At the same time, you're going to start reading about the civil rights movement. You're going to start off with the African American civil rights. Then it's going to talk about the Chicano movement very briefly, and then the American Indian movement, along with feminism and LGBTQ+. So the civil rights movement, it's pushing for equality, and some major achievements within the civil rights movement included, we have the first of 1954 Brown v. Board, and we have like the integration of children into schools. But another big one comes in 1964 when you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And then kind of to up that even more, you have this that's passed, the Voting Acts Act of 1965. Change doesn't come easily, though. Activists faced violence and a lot of resistance, and so some of them were going to act differently. You have this guy here, Malcolm X, who takes a militant stand, a very aggressive and violent stand at the beginning of his political career. Later on, he will turn to more peaceful after he visits the Holy Lands. But he and MLK kind of butted heads against like which type of resistance they should do. Martin Luther King and his followers, they are going to do more passive, peaceful resistance, while Malcolm X and groups like the Black Panthers are going to take a more militant approach. Also, this group here, these ladies are representing the Chicano movement, and a part of that was the Brown Berets. They are a militant group. They are going to we'll use violence if we need to. On the opposite side of that, United Farm Workers, they are going to do more of a passive resistance and a peaceful resistance, a lot like MLK. And then you have the American Indian movement, and it's kind of mixed on that too. American Indians, Native Americans they tried peace treaties in the past that never worked out in their favor. So the American Indian movement, it is going to take a more aggressive approach, like they take over Alcatraz, which is awesome. but Occupation Alcatraz, they're raising awareness. And unfortunately, this group, I think others made a lot of progress. American Indian movement, it did make a lot of progress, but we're still seeing like catching up with others, and it's taking a very long time. That's my personal opinion. The biggest challenge to liberalism was the Vietnam War, and the US got involved to stop communism because we didn't want South Vietnam to fall to communism. So the war dragged on for decades. Casualties are going to increase, and Americans lost confidence in the government. The Tet Offensive, which is pictured here, convinced many Americans the Vietnam War was far from over. Protests grew, especially among students and young people, especially when they found out we're bombing areas. Like we're going into Cambodia and bombing there. We're using like Laos, we're invading here. And that was held secret from the American public. Also, just mass casualties, just going in and killing all civilians, unarmed civilians. That was a huge thing. And that's why a lot of young protesters are going to protest the Vietnam War. 1960s saw anti-war protests, women's liberation, the Chicana movement, the American Indian movement that I talked about, the counterculture, and the youth rebellion. So this is the free speech movement that you're going to read about. Both the left and right criticized liberalism, and the left said it didn't go far enough. The right said it went too far. And the division set up the political shift of the next decade. So the next decade brings us to the 1970s. And by 1968, many Americans were just tired of protests, tired of war, tired of change. And so this guy here, Richard Nixon, he was like, you know what? I promise law and order. I promise stability. I promise to bring an end to war. And he did try to end the war through a process called Vietnamization. And that is reducing U.S. troops while shifting fighting to South Vietnam, training more South Vietnamese to fight in their war. He also changed Cold War strategy. He improved relations with China, which was a communist country, and he also signed arms agreement with the Soviet Union. You'll notice SALT 1 is here. This is a cartoon of SALT 2, but basically we're going to limit the amount of nuclear weapons. And this easing of tension is called détente. So you'll read about that. However, the biggest turning point came with Watergate. So Watergate is just the convention center, and in this convention center, you have like some offices, and that's where the Democratic Party was headquartered. So there's a break-in here, wherever their offices are, at Democratic headquarters, and there's a huge cover-up by the Nixon administration, and it shows evidence of abuse of power. Other things come out. It shows wiretapping that he wasn't supposed to be doing, a whole lot of looking into things. And the weird thing is, like, why? You were gonna win the election. There was no need for you to all this scandal and all this illegal actions that were taken. So here's an interesting fact, though. Before he could face impeachment, before criminal charges were filed against him, Richard Nixon became the only U.S. president to resign from office. And this destroyed public trust in the government. Everything that happened with Watergate, with the election, all that. The 1970s also brought about major economic problems. We have an oil crisis, we have inflation, we have unemployment. You're going to read about this oil crisis and why there was an embargo against the United States. It's because we got involved in the Middle East and we backed a country that no one else in the Middle East was backing. So they're going to put an embargo on the United States. This combination of inflation, high inflation, unemployment, that is called stagflation. Stagflation is when inflation and unemployment happen at the same time. High unemployment, but cost of living continues to go up. Why? That's called stagflation. Jimmy Carter, he tries to restore trust, but he really struggles. So Jimmy Carter, when Nixon resigns, his vice president, Ford, is going to step in. Ford does not win re-election. Jimmy Carter is going to step in, and Jimmy Carter poses himself as an outsider to Washington, D.C. I wasn't involved in the scandal. I didn't know what was going on. So he is elected in as the president. He tries to restore trust, but he really struggles because there's the energy crisis that's happening. There's the Iran hostage crisis. There's a whole, you're going to read about what happened in Iran that led to this hostage crisis. What did we do that would lead to them storming the U.S. Embassy in Iran and taking hostages for over a year. There's also a lot of economic challenges. So even though he does have his success with the Camp David Accords, many Americans felt that the government was very ineffective. He's only in for one term, Carter is. He's going to leave, and we have the rise of the new right. And out of frustration came this new conservative movement. And it really starts with this guy here, Ronald Reagan. The new right focused on lower taxes, smaller government, and traditional values. And it brought together middle-class voters, white religious conservatives, and critics of liberal policies. This movement reshaped American politics and set the stage for the 1980s. And we have this woman here, this is Stop ERA, Stop the Equal Rights Amendment. This amendment would have allowed women equal rights protected under the Constitution, but because of Phyllis and her beliefs and others that followed her and this need to restore conservative values, the Equal Rights Amendment will not pass. Women in the United States do not have equal rights. We could have, but it wasn't ratified, and that's something you're going to read about in these chapters. So let's connect the three chapters. The 1950s, prosperity, but a lot of hidden tensions. 1960s brought reform, protests, and division. The 1970s, there's a lot of crisis, distrust, and then a swing towards conservatism. Each period builds on the one before it. The Cold War fear that helped shape politics. Inequality leads to protest. Protests and war lead to backlash, and that backlash leads to a swing towards being more conservative. So the United States didn't change overnight. Instead, it moved through confidence, conflict, crisis, and realignment. And by 1980, Americans were ready for a new direction, one that emphasized stability, tradition, and limited government. And you're going to see that especially playing out a lot in politics when you have the election of Ronald Reagan and then his vice president, George Bush.